Okay, welcome to the second lecture of week 3 of the semester. Here we're going to be looking at sociology or social psychology impact on the individual. One way to look at it is collective behavior. So what the group influence is on the individual, and then once the individual. So one of the first things we need to do is outline what we're talking about when we're talking about crowds, gatherings, collective behaviors. A crowd, at least in the terms of sports spectator crowds, are temporary gatherings with relatively close proximity. So sometimes this proximity can be a little bit loose, so the areas around a stadium or arena, or the areas within the arena, perhaps an area within a sports bar. In some cases, a crowd, you might think of it as maybe citywide. So after the team wins a championship or loses a championship, if you want to consider all of the city or certain sections of the city that are having riots or vandalism as a single crowd, that's about as far as we could stretch it. Generally speaking, we have a closer proximity than that, where there's a mass of people all sort of kind of within earshot of each other. And a crowd is typically defined as doing an unconventional activity. So it isn't just sort of a regular gathering, it's a specific event or something unusual that has brought them together. So a sports event or a concert or something like that that would bring all of the people together. Now there's a couple ways that they define the activities of the crowd or the behaviors of the crowd. The first is a common activity where everyone in the crowd is working sort of toward the same end or performing the same activity. So all cheering for the team, all booing the ref, all doing a wave or anything else that you can think of that they might do sort of as a single unit. The others is a concerted activity where they are related items, but they're not necessarily doing the exact same thing. So here, if we're thinking about vandalism or rioting after winning a championship, they're all technically part of the riot, but they might be in different parts of the city doing very different things. So there might be some people flipping cars, there might be some people just cheering and jumping up and down in the street. There might be some people looting businesses. Who knows what might be going on? But they're all sort of part of this concerted larger activity of the riot that's happening. Some other definitions when we're thinking of collective behavior, we need 2 or more people, and once we're past that threshold, we can consider it as collective behavior. So you could have collective behavior amongst fans that falls short of what you might think of as a crowd of people, but it's still 5 or 6 fans working sort of together in this common effort or concerted effort. Some other definitions that come up when we're talking about collective behavior, there's a sort of a space, time, and scale that we need to analyze when we're examining collective behaviors, fan activity. The spatial is just space and location. Is it a single spot? Are there multiple spots? Is it an entire city? So it's back to a little bit of the discussion that I had earlier in this lecture. Temporal is really focused on the time. It could be a collective behavior that lasts a few moments only. So after a bad call or what's thought of as a bad call, all of the fan base might share in this collective behavior of booing and hissing, jeering at the ref or the umpire. So it might just be moments. It might be hours of celebration after the game that the collective behavior is that everybody sort of gathers outside the arena and it's a sort of celebratory mood. It could be days. Rarely would we think of this collective behavior in terms of weeks, unless it is sort of maybe if we think of examples outside of the world of sports as sort of a political movement or a revolution or things like that, collective behavior could last weeks, months, years. In terms of sports fans, though, it typically cuts off at sort of the hours, maybe a couple days of rioting or vandalism or things like that. Scale, again, really varies depending on location, actually. It could be sort of harassing 1 or 2 people, a one-on-one type of confrontation, or it could be widespread in the streets of a city. Now, another term that got used in the readings this week was ideology, ideology versus identity. Really, both of these terms are ways to encapsulate kind of larger, more complex activities or behaviors or attitudes. So they're mechanisms for simplifying these larger belief structures about the self, about how the world works. So you can have political ideology, religion obviously plays an important part in people's identity, as well as ideology. But all of these are really sort of self-schemas, if we want to go back to an earlier lecture, of how we can analyze or understand ourself, and we apply ideologies or identities to others as well. So we apply schemas for everyone that we encounter. We have a self-schema for ourself. And then within that, we have sort of salience. So what comes to the fore really is critical to determine how we're going to act in any given setting. And what becomes salient for a setting is typically based on the setting itself. So if we are attending an Oakland Raiders game, our salient identity or our salient ideology might be fan or Raiders fan or NFL fan. It might be a resident of Oakland. Depending on where we're from, it might be a regional identity like that. But again, the main point here is that within ideology and identity, whatever you want to think of it, it's a larger self-scheme. And within that, there are sort of sub-schemes that can get played up in any given moment. So if you're at maybe a political debate, your salient self-scheme, your schema, is going to be more sort of politically focused. If you're at college and attending class, the self-schema that's going to be played up is going to be your college student, or maybe your major, or if you're a student athlete, that element might be played up more. So again, the salience of whatever your presentation is dependent on sort of the context that you're in and what you're trying to accomplish within that context. Now, back to these sort of social identities and the de-individuation that occurs when we're in crowds. So we get sort of lumped in with this larger crowd, and we lose a little bit of the sort of the sense of self, and we're brought into this larger mass of individuals. So we lose the sense of self, we go with the flow, whatever you want to call it. We lose a little bit of sort of personal responsibility and kind of the strength in numbers, if you want to think of it that way, where everybody else was doing it, so I just kind of went along with it. We don't want to stick out and be different from everybody else, especially if this is sort of a peer group or a reference group or part of our social identity. So the de-individuation, it isn't sort of a complete, we become mindless, but there is that sort of effect when we're in a larger crowd that we just kind of want to go with the flow on things. Alrighty, so when we're in crowds, there's a number of ways to look at sort of what impacts violence or aggression or frustration when you're within crowds. One way is to look at issue-relevant or issue-irrelevant factors. So issue-relevant factors would be frustrations that derive from specific issues in your life. So if there are financial strains, issues at work, family issues, just general life. If you want to look at sort of a macro level, cultural issues, a violent society, whatever sort of perspective you have on the world, how it operates, all of those would be issue-relevant factors. And this would encompass really the participant's background and their goals, sort of what they bring into the situation. Issue-irrelevant factors are if we're looking at only the things that happen within the arena of play or within the arena that the fans are in. So here we'd be looking at the play between the two teams or between the competitors, officiating, environmental factors, alcohol or any other elements that would affect sort of physiological responses within the individuals. All of these we might think of as situational factors. So elements within the sporting event or the environment themselves. So really it's a matter of background elements that are causing strain and frustration in life, and then situational elements that are causing strain within the moment. Some theories focus on the outside factors, some focus on the inside factors, but in reality, it seems logical anyway that it would be a little bit of both, right? So we have maybe some of the frustrations of life are carrying with us, having problems at home, problems with finances, those types of things are typically the biggest stressors in people's lives. And then also some situational factors maybe serve as more of like triggers of where maybe we talked about the environment, so maybe the AC in the arena isn't working so well, so it's really hot. They've overbooked a section of first come first served, standing room only kind of section, and it's really packed and cramped. Maybe the refs blowing calls, the home team's losing, whatever else might be going on in the environment. But it seems logical that it would be kind of a mix of both are sort of necessary for fans. So looking at some of those personal background factors, research has actually shown that individuals that come from sort of rough, lower socioeconomic status backgrounds are the ones that tend to have the antisocial behaviors in and around sporting events. Undereducated, underemployed, again, that would fall under that sort of lower SES brackets. Also within sort of the kind of innate, if we're going back to the kind of the psychology of it, the innate desires or the need for danger, need for excitement, the thrill-seeking types of factors, again, back into the person's sort of individual, what they're bringing into the arena with them. And then a lot of research also has pointed to the inordinate need to prove masculinity. So here's really where identity is very much a prominent factor of it. So the masculine identity is just another one of those areas that self-esteem, sense of self, pride, ego, if it's deteriorated elsewhere, so if they're lower SES, so they maybe aren't paid as much as they think they should be, or lower educated, so they don't get a status boost from education or employment, maybe they are looking for that identity boost through masculinity, and then they get that identity boost through masculinity in terms of their sports fandom. Perhaps it used to be participating in sports, but if we're looking at fans, then we're looking at fandom as a source of a masculinity boost. Also, if you add alcohol into it, it really sort of lights the fire if we have all these other sort of these primed antisocial sort of factors that build into perhaps non-normative or aggressive behaviors. Take all of those, add alcohol, and it really. So now that we have the some of the variables that maybe are set the stage for violence to happen, let's take a look at one of the early theories in fan violence is the contagion theory of violence. So here, violence spreads like an airborne disease. So if one fan throws a punch or throws a beer bottle, the next fan notices that. That makes it somehow okay for that second fan to throw the beer bottle, and then maybe 2 or 3 other fans saw that happen, so they start throwing their popcorn, their sodas, their nachos, and it sort of spreads like a disease in some sort of horror film, where if all you have to do is see the violence and somehow you are infected and become violent yourself, or it somehow makes it okay so that you become violent yourself. Scholars have found this to be not always the case. So certainly it doesn't help to see others perform violent actions, and that may have some sort of impact, but it doesn't spread just sort of by merely viewing it. There has to be other variables going on. So scholarship has really shown that it was sort of a nice starting place of once precedence has been set by someone committing a violent act, it's easier for the second person to perform violent acts, but it doesn't have this sort of direct causal relationship spreading out through the crowd like a disease, an airborne sort of virus or something like that. So there's more accurate ways. Not saying that this is necessarily a terrible theory. In some ways it makes sense, but it doesn't hold up enough, and that there are sort of more accurate descriptions of what's really going on. And generally speaking, most fans don't lose all sense of rationality and don't become so suggestible that they immediately take on sort of a mob mentality as soon as they enter a large arena or as soon as they become part of a crowd. They still have some sense of self that is separate of this fan identity that would hold them back from just becoming a sort of a mindless member of the mob. So if not the contagion theory, we got to start looking elsewhere. And one option or one other theory that's been proposed is convergence theory. Here, the idea is that the crowd has lowered inhibitions due to being surrounded by their in-group. So it was surrounded by peers who have the similar value set, all cheering for the same team. You feel very sort of protected and safe within that group, so that lowers your inhibitions. Add in environmental factors and identity, self-defense factors, or any other of those sort of innate factors that a participant might bring into the arena with them, and that is maybe one step farther than contagion theory in allowing for maybe a crowd mentality of lowered inhibitions at least, but also a reliance on those environmental factors and some of those factors of the self, the psychological factors that they would bring into it. So it's sort of one step farther down the road. Another explanation for how the dynamics of a group work is called emergent norms theory. So here the fans already have a sort of a norm toward aggression, at least to a greater extent than regular society has anyway. So I think most scholars would agree that fans and the area around sports is got a higher threshold for tolerance in terms of anger, aggression, frustration, maybe sort of verbal abuse toward refs and opponents, where it's just a little more accepted in that realm than it would be in the larger society. So we already have a norm that's moving toward that. And then the emergent norms theory would suggest that sort of trendsetters or leaders within a fan base can establish new norms or emergent norms depending on the situation. So if the situation sort of starts turning, something in the game triggers it, or player-fan interactions, or some sort of setting, environmental factors would likely play into this as well. Something switches that a trendsetter can sort of establish what is other people are supposed to do at the moment. So they look to this, maybe it's a sort of a well-known fan that dresses the same way, and the crowd sort of looks to him as the sort of the standard bearer of the fan base or something like that, or perhaps the players on the team that they're cheering for start performing in a certain way where they get very aggressive and perhaps violent toward the opponent, and then fans kind of follow that lead. But regardless of whoever the trendsetter is, that person or those people can really shift how the group operates in the moment itself. So there's already, again, a higher tolerance for aggressive types of behaviors within the fan base, and then trendsetters can really push it over the top if they start performing in a certain way and other fans kind of... Now, of the theories of sort of sociology or social psychology and aggression, the one that I find the most compelling is value-added theory. So here we're combining 6 factors, which the authors call determinants. And all 6 of these are necessary sort of ingredients in the recipe, but none of them in and of themselves are enough to sort of set a crowd off into sort of wild mob violent types of behavior. So there might be individuals here and there, but the crowd itself won't just sort of unload violence on a city or on an arena unless all of these are at play. So the first one is that there are structural factors that need to be sort of in place. Temperature, noise, crowding, weather, if it's an incredibly hot day, all of those would play a part in it, and then as well as some of those outside factors. And if you want to think of it as in terms of like city-wide factors or region-wide factors of a really down economy, a dying city, loss of jobs, high poverty rates, high crime rates, all of those are sort of elements that are outside factors that the fan base is bringing with them to the arena. And then once they get to the arena, we have also some sort of environmental situational factors of temperature in the arena, noise, crowding, all sorts of things that are happening within the arena itself. Next, we have structural strain. So things have to be going wrong for structural strain to occur. So obviously the home team that everybody's coming to cheer for is not doing well, because we can put up with a lot of sort of bad structural factors if the team's winning. So if it's hot in the arena and we're kind of down on our luck about the jobs in the city and poverty levels, but we're at the game and the team is really doing well and winning, it kind of cuts it off there. Everybody tends to be in a better mood, because if identity is tied so much to team's performance and the team's doing well, our identity gets a boost. So we need to have structural strain of things not going well, and maybe even some antagonists that are making it not go well. So the opposing team, opposing fans, the refs or the umpires, security and police, or it might even be the organization itself. Even though we're cheering for the team, there might be something about the owner or the GM of a team, something about the administrative side that isn't really working for fans. So somebody has to be an antagonist to build in this sort of structural strain. Things aren't going well. Third, there has to be a general belief that things are going to get worse or things are not going to end up well for us. So structural strain is things aren't going well currently, but that needs to be taken in and sort of generalized that because things are going badly and the refs are blowing all these calls, we're going to get knocked out of the playoffs, or the season's going to be over, or something terrible is going to sort of befall us as a team. And then sort of as my identity is tied in with it, the extension of me will also get that hurt or get that ding because of whatever this antagonist is doing to us. So the ref has blown 15 calls, our season's going to be over. Or if we want to think of this value-added theory applied to sort of a larger scale, if we want to think about sort of the American Revolution as kind of a large-scale collective behavior. Relative deprivation is what one of the readings calls it, where life isn't being fair, I'm not getting what I deserve, taxation without representation, things are going wrong, these people are to blame, and it's going to continue going wrong and get worse if we don't do something about it. That's sort of generalized belief. So those are the first three factors, and then there's three other factors. So there's precipitating incidents. So after we have that generalized belief established, so the ref has blown so many calls, it's going to cost us the game, and then the ref continues to blow calls. These would be precipitating incidents. In terms of the American Revolution, which is a sort of a vastly different type of collective behavior, we have incidents that lead up to this sort of collective behavior. So we have the Boston Massacre, we have a number of acts that are passed that are taxing citizens without representation. So we have a number of sort of precipitating incidents on that sort of larger American Revolution scale. Within the arena, it would be precipitating incidents of the ref blows another call, the opponents didn't get called for a terrible foul they had, the opponent just threw a punch but nobody saw it, the opposing team's fans were doing things to our team that should have been called, or some people should have got ejected but they weren't ejected. Things aren't fair or don't seem fair, and the incidents keep happening. So after the sort of the fourth determinant, precipitating incidents happens, then we move into mobilization, where a leader of our sports fan group or of our fan base throws the first bottle, or the first battery or snowball, depending what city you're in. The first aggressive act is performed. Or it could even be a member of the team throws the first punch. So enough is enough. We got to do something about it. In terms of our revolution, the Sons of Liberty have a Boston Tea Party. The rest is history after that. But at some point, a mobilization needs to happen with some sort of community leaders or social group or fan base leaders. They do something. After that, doing something, that's sort of the sixth and final step, social controls. So if one of the fans chucks a bottle onto the field or throws a beer cup onto the court, what happens next? The counter determinant would be that the security guards come, apprehend the guy, kick him out, tase him, do whatever needs to be done, almost making an example of him. But the social controls, when there's a lack of social controls, it serves as a determinant. So when nothing bad happens to the person that throws the beer bottle, that suddenly starts making it okay as an outlet or as an activity or a behavior for other fans to also participate in. So once we get some sort of mobilization of a fan throwing a beer bottle, if not enough happens to deter other fans from throwing, it's going to start escalating. And that's really where we start getting into collective behavior, and in terms of fan bases, collective, aggressive, violent behavior. So again, it takes all six of these steps to lead to sort of a really negative situation where there's sort of an outbreak of violence or aggression or a fan base that is sort of out of control. And this brings us to our second discussion item of the week. So this one's really more of an assignment rather than a specific discussion. So I want you to apply value-added theory to the Malice at the Palace incident. So if you don't know what Malice at the Palace is, it is a sort of very dark time or dark moment in NBA history where members of the NBA were entering the stands and throwing punches at the customer. Not necessarily saying that some of the customers didn't deserve it, but is still a very bad look for everybody involved. If you don't know what it is, Google it. There are dozens of stories about it. There are at least several YouTube clips that showcase sort of beginning to end what happened at the Malice at the Palace. So apply value-added theory in those 6 determinants. So go through each one of the determinants to see sort of, yes, this happened, here's how it happened. Go through all 6, and then we can maybe sort of have this as our case study in value-added theory of how this applies to the Malice at the Palace and sort of the 6 steps toward chaos in the Palace at Auburn Hills. All right, so this is your last slide for this lecture. So after you conclude discussion item number 2 in your discussion post, you can close out of the lecture and move on to lecture 3.